As we look at the global landscape, we see that oil suppliers' landscape is in flux, with OPEC Plus producers increasingly under pressure from the Atlantic oil that grows its presence on the global market. At the same time, there are clear signs showing that transition away from oil use is picking up pace, particularly in the global road transport and the power sector. And we're likely seeing a global oil demand peak by the end of this decade or sooner, an economic trend now underpinned by the global ambition to transition away from fossil fuels that was agreed by nearly 200 countries last year in Dubai at COP28. This trajectory is, though, not unanimously accepted by the oil and gas industry, and we see the production growing despite the potential risk of an oversupplied market, stranded assets, and lower prices. In this context, the future of oil-producing countries is uncertain, given that they comprise over 50% of all countries on this planet, and about half of them is exporting oil. So this uncertainty left unmanaged may send the world on a bumpy ride for the next couple of decades. This change raises several questions. Some of them are, what are the ongoing trends in oil production and demand, and what economic and security implications the shift in producer-consumer landscape is bringing? What international alliances will have to be reshaped, and what new security pacts will have to be inked as this change goes on? Whose oil will serve the shrinking market, and who will be left behind? How will domestic and regional stability be affected as oil-producing countries struggle to navigate the increasingly volatile markets and replace their dependency on fossil fuel rents? In short, what will the shift in geopolitics of oil look like? Today, we have three excellent speakers to unpack these questions, and we'll do our best to touch upon as many of them as possible during the short time we have. The first speaker to open the panel is Tim Gould, Chief Economist of International Energy Agency. Tim, if you're in the room, please do come up. Tim oversees the supply side of the World Energy Outlook, the IEA's annual flagship report, and the agency's work on investment and critical minerals. Over the last 10 years, he provided tools that define the issues facing today's producers, including the global methane tracker, data on investments, emissions intensities, abatement potentials, low-emission fuels, as well as influential analysis on the oil and gas industry in net zero transitions, with the latest and most comprehensive report on this released last year in the run-up to COP28. Tim believes that energy transition can happen without the engagement of oil and gas industry, but the journey to net zero will be easier and cheaper to navigate if they're on board. Welcome to the panel, Tim. Great to have you here. Our second speaker is Glada Lahn, the Senior Researcher Fellow at Chatham House. Glada, please do come up to the stage. Glada believes that a series of crises is transforming the way oil is traded, raising serious dilemmas for exporters. In her 20 years working for Chatham House and various international organizations, she has worked with producing countries on governance, energy policy, and the implications of transition. She was one of the first to flag the implications of carbon constraints for low and middle-income producers, and is here to talk about some of the issues they face and why this is a serious problem and a shared problem. It's great to have you here, Glada. Finally, our last, but not least, our third speaker, Ambassador Tomas Anker Christensen, the Climate Ambassador of Denmark at the Danish Ministries for Foreign Affairs and Climate, Energy and Utilities. He plays a key part in leading Danish efforts to increase the global climate ambition level in the implementation of the Paris Agreement. He leads Danish climate diplomacy with active engagement in initiatives such as the G20 Task Force for the Global Mobilization Against Climate Change and the G7 Just Energy Transition Partnership, as well as through Danish leadership of global climate alliances like the Beyond Oil and Gas Alliance, the Global Offshore Wind Alliance, and the NDC partnership. Needless to say, Denmark is at the core of the EU's energy transition efforts as well, among others, driving the power system's decarbonization towards a net zero power sector by 2035. Welcome, Ambassador. It's great to have you here. Now let me sit down as well and turn to Tim with our first question. So Tim, given how much data IEA processes and how much analysis it publishes on the trends that are unraveling on the global oil market, could you maybe talk a bit about what trends do you see in terms of shifting producer-consumer landscape and how these trends might change if the transition really accelerates at a pace that is needed for the world to be on track to 1.5 degrees?
Well, thanks a lot, Maria, and it's a great pleasure to join colleagues up on the stage, but also in this magnificent place to talk about these important topics. So you characterized it already very well in your introduction. There are big and important structural changes underway. In our view, that does have significant implications for the outlook for oil, but we are not yet in a world that is transitioning away from oil and gas, certainly. I mean, oil demand, in our view, is probably going to increase by around 1 million barrels per day this year. Because of those structural changes, though, by the end of this decade, the rate of growth declines substantially, so that by the time we reach 2030, we have reached a kind of plateau at around 106 million barrels a day of oil demand, and that's including biofuels. Now, the interesting part, and you also alluded to this, is that there's a lot more supply out there, and there's a lot of supply coming from non-OPEC plus producers, Guyana, Brazil, US, Canada, a few others. And whereas we have 106 million barrels a day of demand, we are on track to have something like 114 million barrels a day worth of supply capacity. And that poses important dilemmas for incumbents, for the major resource holders, particularly those who kind of try to manage those market balances. We already have 6 million barrels a day of spare capacity, spare oil production capacity in the world. And that increases to around 8 million barrels a day in our outlook. Now that's important. That's a big dilemma then for some of the big players. Do they take barrels off the market to keep prices high? Or are we potentially seeing some significant downward pressure on prices, which could then affect those demand trends? So that's a little bit the world we're in. If we were to get on track for climate goals, then we would move away from that sort of plateau around 100 million barrels a day, and we would start to head downwards quite rapidly, because we would be meeting that demand for mobility in other ways, primarily through electricity, and we would be developing cleaner fuels for some other uses of oil today. Now, in a world that is on track for a 1.5 degree stabilization in global average temperatures, that decline is very steep. So that by 2050, you're down to around 25 million barrels a day of oil demand, and most of that, almost all of that, is in non-combustion uses. So it goes into petrochemicals, we use it for asphalt, we use it for waxes, lubricants, various other bits and pieces, but we're not burning it in the way that we burn it today. And that would have very dramatic implications, of course, for oil producers around the world, and I'm sure we'll get into some of those.
Thanks a lot, Tim. That's indeed striking. So we're looking at a market shrinking to 1/4 or below that of what it is today by 2050 if the world is to stick to the 1.5 trajectory and the climate ambition that countries have committed to. And obviously, even in the current landscape, we are looking at a drastically shifting market and a lot of uncertainty coming in for the producing countries. And with that, I would like to turn with my second question to Glada. You have worked a lot on the so-called vulnerable countries, and I know that that term is very ambiguous. Of course, in a sense, all producing countries are vulnerable to energy transition as we're shifting to a completely different backbone of the global economy. But I'd like your take in particular on those who are quite dependent on oil and gas, mostly oil revenues for their economic and political stability, and at the same time are having it hard to compete with low-cost producers that are dominating the market, such as Saudi Arabia, or large producers that are very flexible, like the US. So what implications do you see for these more vulnerable producers coming with that transition accelerating and with the oil demand peak nearing nearing the peak?
Thanks, Maria, and thanks for inviting me. I was looking back this morning at a piece that I had to write for work in 2020, just about what I did at Chatham House, and I mentioned the IEA's hope at that time that emissions would have peaked in 2019. Now, as Tim said, that still hasn't happened. Not only that, but we're in a very different era in terms of the increased distrust between the rule makers and the rule takers in the international system, inability to cooperate to solve some of the most devastating conflicts, and something resembling a new Cold War in terms of trade and investment. There are changes in the oil market on top of that that are being affected by this. So I thought it was best to look first at those and then look at how they affect the vulnerable countries. So what we know is that changes in demand are coming, but they won't be in a straight line, and they won't be geographically even. In addition, we can't use demand and supply fundamentals to project the prices as we might have wanted to do. Geopolitics has returned with a bang to the oil market since 2022. And on top of that, there's various maneuvers by the major producers to secure their market share. And we see this with OPEC+. We see this through things the US is doing and potentially through the BRICS as well. And so what we're going to see, I think, in the next few years is a series of crises caused by the readjustments in the market, the way people change the way they trade, the currency they trade in. And besides that, there's the rapid technological changes and the onset of climate change itself. So in this context, what's vulnerability for oil exporters? And I do want to emphasize that it's not just for oil exporters. I think their vulnerability is our vulnerability, and it's a shared challenge. So there are at least 22 countries in the world for whom oil and gas represents a fifth of government revenue. That's huge. So the Arab Gulf states, there it's mostly over 50%. For Iraq, which is far more vulnerable to price declines, it's over 90%. So declines in price would be a big deal. Beyond the richer GCC countries, you've got Nigeria, Algeria, Angola, Iran, Cameroon, Ecuador, Guinea, Ecuador, Ghana, South Sudan, Equatorial Guinea, so on. So these countries are, they're very vulnerable to political instability if welfare subsidies have to be cut at short notice, and they also could face the combination of higher food prices as well. So we saw what happened when the price of oil and gas dropped as a result of the COVID-19 lockdowns, and I think that gives us a bit of a taster of what could come. It could mean economic ruin for highly dependent countries, economic reforms performed under pressure could destabilize societies, encourage militant actors, and so on. And then there's the current account, the foreign exchange that's needed to purchase imports, and it's needed to service debt. So the oil exporters are usually huge importers of food, machinery, fuel, especially in Nigeria's case. And many exporters are heavily indebted. These include Ghana, Mauritania, Uganda, Chad. And here we can see that the problem of oil and money go together. Credit ratings are strongly tied to GDP growth and debt servicing. And countries are really encouraged to find whatever they can to service that debt. And that incentivizes them to go for the export of raw materials, including fossil fuels, to earn the currency to repay the debt. So you have something of a vicious cycle. And although the markets for those fuels are changing, countries are still locked in that trap. And here, countries face a couple of raw edges: the increase in divestment, so companies letting go of their high carbon, high risk assets to meet their net zero or decarbonization targets, and the multilateral development banks also being less willing to de-risk large infrastructure projects, say for gas-fired power or refining, that might, as countries see it, help them to become more energy self-sufficient. And you might well say that renewable energy is the future, but money isn't flowing freely enough for that either, nor for efficiency and many other industrial needs. So I just want to say, have I got 1 minute? So there are some opportunities. There's some ways through this messy situation. If we return to the geopolitical shifts, the current competition over relationships with the global south, between US and China, with a number of middle powers in the middle, provides some choices for global south countries, for developing countries. Non-alignment is a common policy, and as uncomfortable as that may be for some, it offers this opportunity to address some of the systemic power imbalances and have a more constructive dialogue about transition, if we seize the opportunity. And that means opening for much better packages on the table for green structural transformation, not just renewable energy. I think we can learn a lot from the failures so far of the JETPs and some of the successes to improve on that package. That'll be, renewable energy and efficiency will be essential for meeting energy access and industrial needs, but it's not going to suffice in terms of foreign exchange and the need to address the balance of trade. regional trade and the broadening of the tax base to help those countries through the shift away from fossil fuels.
Thanks a lot, Glada. You've opened up a lot of issues here, but I think the top message or two are really that what we are talking about here in terms of the challenge for the oil producers is it is not just decarbonizing their energy systems, which is of course key and important, but it is embarking on a whole of economy transition that can replace that part of economy that is now dependent on fossil fuel trade and revenue with something else. And from the way it sounds, as you talked about the dependency of credit rate rankings and GDP, the debt issue, the global finance issue, it seems like the global system, the economic and financial system will have to change as well in order to support this transition. But at the same time, we already have some first movers who have managed to transition as we speak. And I'm delighted to have the ambassador for climate of Denmark here to offer some lessons learned. Ambassador, you come from a country that over the last 2 decades not only managed to drastically reduce its oil and gas production, but also to turn its national oil, state oil and gas company into a leading renewables company. This is an unprecedented experience, I would say, globally, and I was wondering if you can tell us a bit about the lessons learned from this experience, and if there is something for the producers who are now contemplating how to transition away from that dependency that they can learn from Denmark.
Thank you very much for having us in this panel. I'd love to come back to where Glada left off, but let me just start with the Danish experience. And I should start by saying that I'm not sure we have really curbed production yet, but we are probably the first OECD producer country that has set an end date to production and an end to issuing governmental licensing rounds for our oil fields in the North Sea. We thought, well, there's both an idealistic reason for that. We think that as a developed country, in the spirit of the Paris Agreement, we are in a way committed to moving first. That's what the Paris Agreement tells us that we should do as developed countries. We're being asked to curb emissions, and the best way to do that is actually to look at the source of the emissions, the fossil fuels. And hence, we set an end date for our oil and gas production in 2050 and no new licenses. But that also came because for about a decade, the transition, you alert to the transition of the Danish oil and natural gas company into Ørsted, that also operates offshore wind farms in the UK, was taking place sort of within the logic of them looking at the global coal and oil and gas markets and seeing a huge opportunity in becoming the world's first global offshore wind operator. And our other large oil and gas company, they saw the writing on the wall as well and sold their assets in the North Sea to Total. Basically because they said if everybody starts implementing the Paris Agreement, demand for oil and gas will go down, as Tim described it, in the not too distant future. That will mean a demand destruction, and our assets will be worth less, and hence we better sell them while we still get a good price for them. A very reasonable approach, except of course in a few years no one will be able to do that because your assets are stranded and there will be lower demand, and hence you're stuck with your expensive assets. And in a way that's what Glada is describing, that many countries in the global south who have invested in these oil and gas explorations will be left with a huge debt and no market for the product. And what we then did was to engage our industry, but also our unions, in a discussion on also the just part of the transition and transitioning the workforce from being oil and gas workers into being offshore wind workers. Obviously, that is not something every country can do, but you have to realize that for many countries, there is an issue around the workforce in the sense that it doesn't really matter to your local workers if you create jobs in another part of your country. it's the same people who need new jobs. Otherwise, you are creating parts of your country that will be desolate and left behind. And at least for us, that was not an option. So if you go to the Danish port city of Esbjerg, you can see that it's no longer building offshore oil and gas towers, but building wind towers instead. It's maybe the world's largest assembly line for offshore wind now. It's a pretty impressive site. And in that sense, we are also shifting our revenue base from the income we've had for the last 50 years from oil and gas to being now much more focused on revenue from wind and from the green technology. Again, you can argue that's not every country on the planet that can do that, but if we are to meet the tripling of renewable energy targets agreed in Dubai last year, along with the transition away from fossil fuel, the global market for these technologies is huge, and there's a lot of space for everybody to expand for the time being. As part of the decision to end production in the North Sea, the Danish government and parliament actually asked us to then also set up a global alliance to go beyond oil and gas. And this alliance is the go-to place for the conversation amongst producers for what the future of oil and gas production will look like. We are having very quiet conversations in this group, but we're also offering support for producers in the global south who want to know what their macroeconomic risk is, and the demand for that kind of analysis is vastly increasing, including some of the countries that Glada mentioned that are knocking on our door and realizing that if the demand crush that Tim described, when that happens in about 10 years, it's probably too late to diversify your economy and look at new sources of revenue. So you actually have to start planning for, let's say, the OECD countries meeting their 1.5 trajectories in 10 years in order that you will not then basically become a failed state because of the revenue destruction that you will be facing. So more and more governments are knocking on our door and saying, we'd actually like to know. And then thirdly, this alliance is also part of the group of countries that push for having transition away from fossil fuels in the UAE consensus, primarily because we think that also in the global climate space, we do need to have a serious conversation about the managed transition. There's no world where we are on a 1.5 trajectory where demand destruction doesn't happen. Tim just described it. So rather than having a chaos in the global economy, we do need to find a way to have if you want, an adult conversation about that transition, also about the just transition, so that we create the least harm and actually try to make it an inclusive transition for everyone.
Excellent remarks. Thank you. Thank you a lot, Ambassador. And I think there are some real lessons learned, particularly for the OECD producing countries, that Denmark can offer. We are hosting one of the. Our host is one of those producers, the UK, of course. And I think the topic of oil and gas production phase out is quite high on the agenda in this country, as is in Norway, for example, if we look at Europe. But I wanted to turn back a bit to the future landscape of oil-producing countries in that shrinking market. It does sound a bit from what you described, Tim, that it's the cost effectiveness or cost of production that will predetermine who will get to turn the lights out. But there are other factors coming in, including the emissions intensity of production and emissions regulations. We've just seen the EU introducing methane regulations on oil imports. There are probably security implications that need to be considered, with a lot of countries friendshoring their trade to more democratic countries. There are existing relationships for Europe. The North African neighborhood is quite critical, even despite the unstable political climate. So given all these implications coming to that driver of cost effectiveness, and then we have, of course, the climate justice and the just energy transition that Ambassador has just mentioned, where you have to give the developing countries a fair chance to transition and give an opportunity for their economies to shift in time. So taking all those into consideration, I know this is a huge question, but what would you see as the landscape for producing countries in, let's say, 10 to 15 years? What countries will have to drop out and are kind of urgently needing support right now, and what countries will stay in the market anyway and will have to shift themselves?
Well, I'm nowhere short of time, so I'll basically agree with Ambassador Christensen, because we need to have that conversation, because it's not clear yet what criteria we will use in order to make that assessment. Is it going to be left to the market, in which case you're probably going to see a concentration of production amongst some of the low-cost producers? Are we going to see things through an energy security lens? If so, who do we deem to be the secure producers, and how do we attach value to the security of that output? Are we going to be looking at it through an emissions intensity lens, in which case we need to have a lot better data on who's producing with what emissions intensities and how low those methane emissions are and other sources of emissions associated with the production and transportation of oil and gas. And there's a very important equity dimension, as you said. But if equity is to be a consideration here, then how do you, in a sense, reserve any space in the market for people to fill that? And so I think we need to get away from the idea that the transition away from fossil fuels is just a sort of function of us building up a clean energy system. There are important strategic policy, geopolitical issues around how we do that. And that conversation, I think, is just starting, but it's an extremely important conversation to have.
Absolutely. And of course, you've just mentioned kind of the ways how to keep countries, or how to allow countries to continue, let's say, cashing in on oil trade while the market is shrinking to fund that transition. But we all know that this game is finite, and as oil demand is dropping, if the climate ambition is really to be implemented the way governments committed to, then we are looking not just at countries that need to stay in the market, but we're looking at majority of countries who will have to drop out, and to devise some other strategies to maintain their economic integrity, to maintain the economic growth, to keep their populations wealthy. And I was wondering, given that you have mentioned BOGA, Glada, you have mentioned a lot of, I think, implicitly financial institutions that have to come on board. What do you think the other part of this kind of stakeholder equation can do to support the transition? I'm talking about consuming countries, I'm talking about developed producing countries, and I'm talking about global mechanisms or international mechanisms that need to be created to support this transition. I know this is it's a starting conversation, right? We committed to transition away from fossil fuels finally last year, and we're now finally starting to define what this means, what support mechanisms are needed for those countries that need to transition. But if you have any first ideas you'd like to flag, it would be great. Glada and Tomas.
Just a really broad observation. So perceptions of hypocrisy and double standards are really acute right now. And I think in that context, for some of the richer countries in the West and elsewhere, they need to get off their climate high horse. They need to talk about, they need to talk very practically, take a look at where their own policies at home are incoherent with what they're preaching abroad, and where they're, giving out very, very well-intentioned climate finance and assistance that could be completely counteracted by their consumption and trade preferences, as well as their enablement of, tax avoidance, tax havens, etc., which are playing a huge role in helping to siphon off wealth from many of these countries who really need it to assist with their transition. So I think looking at these things, and then secondly, turning to what Tomas said, is integrity. Integrity talks. Integrity is the name of the game now. And if a country can't practice at home what it preaches abroad, it's not a good look, and it's not effective in terms of soft power. So, countries like the UK, Canada, Norway, US, etc., we want to see the first movers too in that, and I think they will gain from that in terms of influence too.
Just very quickly, I think the most important part of the transition away the most important discussion hasn't really started yet, which is how we fund it. and what the financial models for phasing out oil and gas are. I think we would need to set up a panel of economists, Nobel Prize takers, to think that through, but also involving the financial markets and the financial sector. I think you here in London, with the City of London, have a great place to start, but it's clear that the IMF, the MDBs, the various global institutions in the financial system don't have an answer to that question yet. But if we were to take on, say, trying to do a just energy transition partnership with Colombia, which might be the country most vocally asking for it, then that would allow us to start then looking at what it actually is that we can fund and how. There's no pool of money large enough to compensate for the loss of revenue that is caused also by the market shifting. But then what do we do? I don't have the answer, but I know that the question looms heavy on the horizon, and maybe for countries to do their NDCs in the next round that covers the period from 2030 to 2035, that is 10 years from now, we will have to be able to give some kind of response to that for them to actually deliver the ambition that they need.
That's a great point. So you're saying essentially the NDC update process can be used to give a powerful signal to both investors and producing countries where the market is going, so the finance can be shifted in a more managed and quicker way. That's an excellent remark, which brings me to my closing question. I wanted to set us in the timeline a bit, because of course this is a fundamental conversation we're having here. We're just starting, but we need to start somewhere. And now that we're nearing the middle of the decade of action, as we have called the 2020s, and the COP 2030, where the NDC update process has to kick off, or ahead of which the NDC update process has to kick off, I'm wondering, what is the one thing each of you think must have happened by then to pave the key roadblock on the way to that managed transition for oil and gas producing countries?
I'll kick things off. I think I'm going to echo something that Glada was saying. We need to sort of incentivize shifts that move producers in a positive direction, and that means attaching value to lower emissions production, but also it means collaboration on new technologies and creating some real incentives to move into sort of low emissions gases, low emissions fuels. There are important technologies that are adjacent to the skills of the existing oil and gas industry, and there need to be reasons why the producers move in that direction.
So many things to say. I think a more open dialogue between consumers and exporters, and just keeping those channels open, being very clear, very coherent in terms of the policies that are being laid out that are going to affect demand, and then matching that with finance, but not forgetting to address indebtedness at the same time in a fair way.
I think much more openness about what a managed transition looks like, and a more realistic approach to it, getting away from the shouting matches at the COPs, which are so noisy and so crowded that it's very difficult actually to have those as spaces for doing policy.
Thanks a lot, the three of you. Please give the round of applause to our excellent speakers. This is, of course, just the first of hopefully many conversations to be had on this fundamental topic, but thanks you all for the attention. Let's move on to the next panel.